The night was heavy with silence, the kind that only comes before a storm. The crew had spent the last few weeks walking the fine line between peace and war. Cori's words still echoed in their heads. If you still here, you still got a chance. They hadn't made any major moves, hadn't dropped any bodies. But the weight of that decision was starting to show, not just in the way they held themselves, but in the way the city looked at them. The streets weren't forgiving, and they never would be. D.G. Mula stood in the doorway of the trap house, staring out into the dark, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Was it enough to just walk away? Had they made the right choice? He knew deep down that they had to change, but the streets had a way of pulling you back in, and it wasn't done with you until it had its hold on you again. Snubz was feeling the pressure too. He'd been quieter than usual, his eyes always scanning, always watching. He knew the moment they started talking about leaving the game, others would be watching closely. The real power wasn't in the hustle, it was in the fear they could instill. If they were no longer feared, then they were vulnerable. Tuda and No Party spent their days keeping the money coming in, trying to stay low while dealing with their own inner battles. They knew what the streets could do to you, how easy it was to get pulled back in, how quickly everything could spiral. But neither of them had the clarity D.G. Mula and Cori seemed to have. The idea of walking away was too foreign, too distant. Forrest watched it all unfold from the shadows, a quiet observer, always trying to figure out what was real and what was just a front. He was the wild card, the one who hadn't fully committed to the streets or the idea of redemption. He was somewhere in between, just waiting to see who would make the first move. King 2 was still struggling with the loss of his brother. Revenge still burned inside him like an open wound, and every time he thought about letting go, he could feel the anger pulsing in his veins. He'd come so close to pulling the trigger, to finishing what he had started, but something held him back. Maybe it was Cori's voice in his head. Maybe it was the thought of his own mother, grieving once again for a son she would never get back. But the streets weren't done with them yet. No matter how hard they tried to walk away, the shadows were always close behind, ready to pull them back in. The day came when they could no longer ignore the storm brewing on the horizon. A phone call, a sudden whisper in the streets. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen their hesitation, and someone was going to make sure they paid for it. The crew gathered again, this time in a more secure location. It was time to face what they had been avoiding. The truth was, no one could walk away clean. Not in this game. Not in these streets. "They're coming for us," Snubz said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "You can feel it in the air. They ain't just gonna let us slide. They gonna make us pay for every step we took away from the life." Tuda looked up from his phone, his eyes hard. "So what do we do now?" King 2 slammed his fist into the table, his anger flaring again. "We fight back. We take the streets back. We show them we ain't weak." "No," Cori said, shaking her head. "This ain't about fighting back. It's about surviving. And if you go back to the old ways, you're not surviving. You're just feeding the cycle." There was a long pause as the crew looked at each other, each of them weighing their options. The choice was clear. If they stayed on this path, they'd either break the cycle or become part of it. The question was, who would make it out, and who would be left behind? Forrest finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "We don't have to fight the streets. We have to fight for ourselves." But the reality was harsher than any of them had imagined. The streets didn't care about change. They didn't care about redemption. They only cared about who was still standing when the smoke cleared. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm that had already broken but hadn't finished its course. They had been walking a razor-thin line between redemption and retaliation, but the moment was coming. They all felt it. D.G. Mula's phone buzzed late one night. A message from an unknown number. "You can't walk away, Mula. Not like this." The message was clear. No one was going to let them live in peace. The streets weren't done with them, and there was no such thing as walking away unscathed. It was either bloodshed or survival, and both had their costs. Snubz stood in the kitchen of their safe house, staring at the cracked screen of his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad, but he didn't send a response. He already knew what came next. The streets wouldn't give them a choice. They couldn't just slip away into the shadows. They had made enemies, and now those enemies were coming. King Two's mind was still torn. Every moment was a fight against the ghosts of his past. His brother's death still haunted him. The drive for revenge burned brighter than anything else, but there was a voice in his head, one he couldn't ignore, reminding him of the cost. Every decision had consequences, and the more he fought for vengeance, the more he lost himself. He could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting the streets, he was fighting himself. Cori had been the calm in the storm, the one who tried to keep everyone grounded. She could see the path that lay before them, the one that led out of this madness. But she also knew that getting out wasn't simple. The streets wouldn't let them go so easily. The moment they tried to break free, they would be hunted, and the only thing keeping them alive would be their ability to adapt. Forrest, ever the observer, kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He had seen enough of this life to know that nothing lasts forever. The streets chewed people up and spit them out, and the ones who survived were the ones who knew when to walk away and when to fight. "Tonight," Cori said, breaking the silence in the room, "we decide." Nobody said anything at first. The weight of her words hung in the air, the decision so simple and yet so impossible. No one wanted to admit that the game was up. No one wanted to accept that the cycle they had lived in for years might be coming to an end. But the truth was undeniable. The streets were changing, and the only way to break the cycle was to make a choice. King Two stood up, his face hardening with resolve. "If they want a war, then we'll give them one. I'm not running, not anymore." Cori shook her head. "It's not about fighting. It's about living. If we fight, we'll just become part of the cycle. We can't let them drag us back in." The room fell silent as each member of the crew reflected on her words. The cycle was the problem. It was the reason they were stuck in this world of violence, revenge, and bloodshed. The question wasn't whether they could survive the war, it was whether they could survive the peace. "You can't fight peace," Forrest said quietly. "You either let it in or you die fighting the ghosts of your past." It wasn't just a statement, it was a warning. The ghosts of the past were powerful. They could haunt you, drag you back to the streets, force you to pick up the gun and the blade to answer the call of vengeance. But peace, real peace, was something that had to be fought for. The crew spent the rest of the night talking, weighing the risks, the costs, and the choices they had made. They knew that no matter what path they took, there would be consequences. But for the first time in a long while, they felt like they might have a chance. A real chance at breaking the cycle. A chance to live on their own terms. The morning light broke through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. It was time. They had one final choice to make. The streets weren't going to stop coming. No matter how hard they tried to walk away, there was always something, someone trying to pull them back in. But they had made their decision. DG Mula was the first to speak, his voice steady but filled with a quiet power. "We fight for our lives, not for revenge, not for the streets. We fight to get out." Snubz nodded, his face grim. "I'm in. Let's break the cycle." Tuda, ever the pragmatist, kept his eyes on the bigger picture. "We're going to need a plan. This ain't going to be easy." "I've got one," Cori said. "But we move smart. We keep our heads low, don't feed the fire. We don't make any more enemies, but we don't let anyone think we're weak either." King Two was still torn, the rage still bubbling beneath the surface. But he knew what Cori was saying was right. "I don't know if I can just let it go." "You don't have to let it go," Cori said softly, "but you can control it. You control what happens next." Forrest stood silently, watching the others as they made their decisions. He didn't need to speak anymore. It was clear that the crew was ready to step out of the darkness, to break free from the cycle that had consumed them for so long. The choice had been made, the cycle would end here. But the question was, would they live long enough to see it through? The crew had made their choice, but the real test was just beginning. They couldn't just walk away from the life they had known, not without consequences. The streets had a way of making you pay, even when you thought you were done. And right now, the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. DG Mula paced back and forth, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He had never been afraid of the consequences before, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, about breaking free from the cycle that had claimed so many before them. "We can't run forever," Snubz said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of doubt. "We can't hide in the shadows. Sooner or later they'll come for us." "We don't run," Cori said, looking at each of them in turn, "but we don't give them what they want either. The game has changed. We change with it." King Two's hands were clenched into fists, the anger still there, burning beneath the surface. "I'm not about to just sit back and wait for them to come. I'll make sure they know we ain't weak." "No," Cori said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This isn't about proving strength through violence. This is about proving we can stand on our own, without the streets, without the bloodshed." Forrest leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, taking it all in. "It's going to take more than words to convince them we're done. They won't just let us go." "I know," DG Mula said, his voice low, "but it's the only way forward. We do this the right way, or we end up just like everyone else, caught in the same trap." The crew knew what they had to do. They needed to take control of their own destiny, not let the streets dictate it. They had to be smart, strategic, and patient. But most of all, they had to stick together. The days passed in a blur, the crew operating in the shadows, planning their next move. They didn't trust anyone, not completely. There were whispers everywhere, eyes always watching. They had to move carefully, and they had to move in silence. DG Mula spent his time laying low, checking in with trusted allies who weren't part of the game anymore, people who had found their way out. He wasn't sure who he could trust, but he knew that alliances were more important than ever. The wrong move could cost them everything. Snubz kept his ear to the streets, listening for any signs of trouble, any hint that someone was planning to make a move against them. He was quick to pick up on things others might miss, and right now that skill was crucial. King Two had been quieter than usual, spending his time away from the crew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The streets had a way of getting into your head, and he still had unfinished business. But Cori's words lingered in his mind. Control it, don't let it control you. He wasn't sure if he could do that, but he had to try. Tuda and No Party stayed in the background, running things quietly. They didn't talk much about what was coming, but they knew the risks. They were the ones who made sure the money kept flowing, that their operations remained undetected. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Forrest, as always, observed. He didn't get involved too much, but he kept his eyes open, watching for any cracks in their plan. He had a gut feeling that something was about to go down, something that none of them were prepared for. And then it happened. It wasn't just a matter of surviving anymore. It was a matter of trust. And that trust was shattered when they received word that someone in their circle had turned. A trusted ally, someone who had been in the game as long as they had sold them out. DG Mula stood in the middle of the room, his jaw tight as he processed the news. "Who did it?" he asked, his voice cold. Snubz shook his head. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they're going to make sure we pay." Cori's face hardened. "It doesn't matter who it is, it's about what we do next. We stick together. We don't let this tear us apart." But King Two was already on edge. "No one betrays me, no one." "We don't know who did it yet," Cori reminded him, her voice firm, "but we have to focus. We can't fall apart now." The betrayal stung deeper than anything they had faced. It wasn't just about someone selling them out, it was about the trust that had been broken. The crew had made it this far because they had each other's backs, but now that loyalty was in question. Forrest spoke up, his voice low and measured. "Whoever it is, we handle it smart. We don't react with anger. We find out who and we move on it." "Exactly," DG Mula said, taking a deep breath. "We don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us fall apart. We handle this like we've handled everything else, together." But deep down, each of them knew that the streets had just become a lot more dangerous. The betrayal was the sign of something bigger. They were in deeper than ever before, and there was no going back. The betrayal was a wound that refused to heal. Each of the crew members could feel it, gnawing at them in the silence of the nights they spent awake, plotting their next move. The idea of someone they trusted turning against them was more dangerous than any enemy on the street. It was the kind of blow that could tear everything apart. D.G. Mula sat alone, his eyes locked on the flickering streetlight outside. The city felt quieter now, almost too quiet. The weight of what had happened was heavy on him, and the thought of being constantly watched gnawed at his mind. Whoever turned on them knew their moves, knew their weaknesses. They were always one step ahead. The paranoia was unbearable. "We need to find out who did this," Snubz said, his voice low but resolute. "And we need to do it fast, no telling who else they've given up." "I know," D.G. Mula replied, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table, "but it's not just about finding them. It's about making sure no one else thinks they can do the same." King 2 was pacing again, the anger from the betrayal bubbling to the surface. "I don't care who it is. I'm going to find them. I'll make sure they never get a chance to do this again." "No," Cori interjected, her tone calm but firm. "We don't move on impulse. We do this smart. We need information. We need to know exactly who turned on us and why." "Cori's right," Forrest added quietly. "We're not dealing with some rookie. Whoever this is, they know how to play the game. We need a plan." Tuda and No Party stayed quiet, their eyes scanning the room. They were always the silent ones, but in times like this, their silence was golden. They understood what was at stake. They understood that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about showing the streets that they could stand their ground. "We'll split up," D.G. Mula said, finally looking up from the table. "We'll hit the streets, get to those who still owe us, see if they've been talking. If we find out who did this, we move on them quickly." King 2 clenched his fists. "I want to be the one to do it. I want to make them pay." "Don't do this out of rage," Cori warned. "Rage won't get us anywhere. If we move on impulse, we risk everything." But King 2 was already out the door, his mind set on vengeance. The others knew he wouldn't listen to reason right now, and they couldn't afford to waste time trying to calm him down. They had bigger problems. Chapter 14, The Shadows Close In. Days passed, and the crew moved with precision. They checked in with old contacts, reconnected with people they hadn't seen in years, all in search of information. No one trusted anyone anymore. The streets felt different, colder, more dangerous. King 2 was relentless. He was everywhere, asking questions, following leads, burning bridges when necessary. He didn't care about the consequences. He just wanted the person who betrayed them to pay. He'd learned long ago that if you didn't strike first, you'd end up a target. And right now, he felt like the streets were closing in on him. Snubz had his ear to the ground. He was careful, methodical, never revealing too much of what he knew, but everywhere he went, there were whispers. Someone knew something. The crew's enemies were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension was thick, and it was only a matter of time before someone would make a move. Tuda and No Party were the calm in the chaos, keeping their operations smooth and quiet. They had no intention of letting their guard down, knowing that the real danger lay in the uncertainty of who might be next. Forrest, ever observant, began to see patterns in the chaos. He wasn't as eager to rush in, but he had a feeling that the person who betrayed them wasn't just after money. It was personal. The game had changed, and someone was playing it in a way they hadn't anticipated. "We're getting close," D.G. Mula said, looking at the others, "but we need to stay sharp. No mistakes. If we don't handle this right, we're all dead." "King 2's out of control," Snubz muttered. "If he doesn't calm down, he's going to make a move that we can't recover from." "I know," Cori said, her voice tight, "but we can't force him to stop. We just have to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." And then, the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Chapter 15, The Final Confrontation. They had their lead. The betrayal had come from someone close to the crew, someone who had been with them since the beginning. It was a shock to the system, a blow that hit harder than any enemy they had ever faced. The crew stood together in an abandoned warehouse, the tension thick in the air. They had tracked the betrayer to this location, and they knew that this was the moment of truth. There was no turning back. King 2 was the first to move, his eyes locked on the figure standing in the shadows. The figure stepped into the light, revealing their face, a face they all knew too well. "You," King 2 growled, "you were the one who sold us out." The man didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do. You guys were always too soft. You thought you could walk away, but the streets don't let you go that easy. I did what I had to do to survive." King 2's hand hovered near his waistband, the anger surging within him. "You're dead." "Don't do it," Cori said, her voice sharp. "We can't let this become about vengeance. If we kill him, we're no better than anyone else in these streets. It's not worth it." The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, everything felt like it was frozen in time. The streets had already taken so much from them, but the hardest lesson was learning that sometimes the only way to survive was to walk away from the violence. King 2 took a deep breath, his fingers twitching at his side. He wanted to pull the trigger, but he also knew that Cori was right. If he killed this man, it wouldn't bring his brother back. It wouldn't change anything. It would only drag him deeper into the cycle. The crew stood together, eyes locked on the betrayer. They knew the choice they had to make. And with one final glance at his crew, DG Mula stepped forward. "We're done here," he said quietly, his voice filled with cold determination. "The cycle ends now." The warehouse was still, the echo of DG Mula's words hanging heavy in the air. The decision had been made, and the crew could feel the weight of it. The tension that had once felt suffocating now seemed to dissipate into the darkness, leaving a strange quiet behind. King 2's gaze remained fixed on the betrayer, his fists still clenched at his sides. He was furious, his emotions running wild. But deep down, he knew Cori was right. He knew that taking the life of someone who had once been a part of their crew wouldn't bring peace. It would only continue the cycle of destruction they had been trying to escape. The betrayer stood there, unafraid. He knew they had the power to end him right then and there, but he also knew they were better than that. He had made his choice, but now it was up to them to make theirs. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," the betrayer said, his voice cold. "I did what I had to do. The streets have a way of making you choose. You either play or get played." Cori stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the man who had once been part of their circle. "You chose the streets. You chose survival over loyalty. But what you don't understand is that the real way to survive is to break the cycle. You can keep playing, but it won't make you any better than the ones who came before you." There was a long pause, and then the betrayer let out a dry laugh. "You really think you're different? The streets don't care about loyalty, about right or wrong. The streets don't change. People do." DG Mula finally spoke, his voice filled with calm finality. "We're not the same. We've made our choice. We're walking away no matter what it costs us. We're breaking the cycle." The betrayer's eyes narrowed, but there was no fight left in him. He knew he had lost this battle. "You think you can just walk away?" he asked, the doubt in his voice now clear. "You think they'll let you? The streets never let anyone go." "We'll see about that," Snubz said, stepping forward, his voice sharp. "You made your choice. Now we make ours." With those words, the crew turned and walked away, leaving the betrayer standing alone in the warehouse. They didn't need to shed blood to prove their point. They had already proven that the streets couldn't control them anymore. They were done with the violence, done with the game. Chapter 17, The Calm After the Storm. The days that followed were quieter than they had been in years. The crew had made their decision, and while the streets still buzzed with rumors and whispers, they had found a strange sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. DG Mula spent time rebuilding connections, but this time it wasn't about hustling or survival. He was focused on something bigger, his future. He wasn't sure what that future would look like, but for the first time, he felt like he could actually see a way out. The streets had always been his home, but now they felt like a trap, a cycle that had no end. It was time to find something else. Snubz, too, had begun to change. He still moved through the city, still kept his ear to the ground, but there was a quiet resolve about him. He wasn't searching for enemies anymore. He was searching for something better. It wasn't about escaping the streets anymore. It was about building something real, something that couldn't be taken away. King 2, ever the firebrand, had a harder time letting go. The anger still burned in him, and there were days when it felt impossible to hold it all inside. But he knew, deep down, that fighting for vengeance wouldn't bring his brother back. It would only drag him deeper into a world he was trying to escape. Slowly, he began to channel that anger into something else, something more productive. He wasn't sure if he could fully leave the streets behind, but he was learning to control it. Cori became the anchor for them all. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who kept them grounded, but now she was more than that. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, change was possible. The streets had almost claimed her, but she had fought her way back, and now she was showing them that there was life beyond the cycle. Forrest remained the quiet observer, always watching, always waiting. He had seen the damage the streets could do to a person, but he had also seen the strength it took to break free. He didn't know what the future held, but he had a feeling that, together, they could carve out something different. Tuda and No Party 2 had found new purpose. They worked quietly in the background, keeping things steady while the others adjusted to the new reality. They knew it wasn't going to be easy, but they also knew it was possible. They had all made it out alive, and that was more than most could say. The streets had tried to break them. The cycle had almost swallowed them whole. But they had chosen something different. They had chosen redemption, and in doing so, they had found freedom. Epilogue: Breaking the Cycle. The city never truly changes. The streets will always be there, waiting for the next generation to walk down the same path, make the same mistakes. But for DG Mula and his crew, the cycle had been broken. They had chosen to live differently, and for the first time in a long while, they were at peace with that choice. The cycle wasn't something that could be erased, but for them it was something that no longer had control. And for the first time, they were free.